Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another 3 Studio Max tutorial by Kevin Harper. I've gotten a few requests to go over some of the mParticle parameters within 3 Studio Max 2014, and so here we go. We're just going to run over some a very quick overview, not over all of the features, but just a few that I think are interesting and we should have a look at. There are a few features that I'm not familiar with, so there's still going to be some stuff that you're going to have to look up, but let's see what we can do here. Okay, so first of all, let's hit 6 to open up the particle view, and if you are familiar with PFlow, then most of the stuff looks very familiar, but you'll also notice that there are a bunch of new operators within our particle view. So the first one we're going to take a look at is a new flow. You're familiar with the standard flow, which basically just creates a nice little particle system of a few particles falling down with just a speed, but this has nothing to do with physics or anything like that, and that's pretty much the strong part about mParticles, is that it is very physics driven. So we can drag in an mFlow in here instead of a standard flow, and what we'll see is that it creates a few items. It creates a nice little and familiar particle system. It creates a mWorld, which was a physics world back in the days. If you are subscribed to my channel, then you already noticed from the flying paper tutorial that we made, but I'm going to go over these features anyway, so forgive me if it's redundant, because this is more an intermediate tutorial instead of the other one, which was more advanced. Okay, so this is an mWorld, MP world, so mParticle world, which was a physics world, which used to be a plugin and was now integrated into 3 Studio Max. The arrow down indicates that it has gravity turned on, so if we, with the mWorld selected, we can say don't apply gravity. And this X on the bottom means that it has a collision ground plane. So if we turn that off, we can see that there's a visual representation of it. Now this created a few particles within a grid. I think this is a 5x5 grid, yeah. So when we run the timeline, unlike the normal particle system, we're going to see that the particles really behave within a physics world. And not just that, with the old particle system, when you had collisions happening, they would happen at the pivot point of the particle. So it doesn't matter what your particle shapes were. If you had a box, the pivot point of the particle is actually where they would collide. And so if you had two particles that were two boxes collide with each other, they would intersect each other until they get to the pivot points, and then they would react as if they're colliding. In this case, however, it takes the shape of the particle into account because it generates a collision mesh sort of thing, right? So it's independent of the visual mesh, but it can very closely resemble the visual mesh. So we're going to first talk about some of the new birth events. So this is a grid birth. A grid birth is very nice because what you could do is you can go in here, and if you change the icon size, you see it dynamically changes how many particles there are. So you don't really specify how many particles you want. You specify the grid within you which you want to fill with particles. Another parameter that is important is of course the grid size, which is really should be called like spacing or something like that. It doesn't really affect the size of the actual grid. That's more like the icon size at the bottom. but what it affects is the spacing between particles. So if you increase this number, you're going to see less particles because you're increasing the spacing between particles within the grid, right? If you decrease this number, obviously you'll see more particles, and they will not care about intersecting each other, which now I bumped it up maybe a little too high for my system, but they will not care about intersecting each other. You see, this looks almost like a solid block, but these are a lot of particles. Let's tone that down just a little bit maybe. They will not care that they're intersecting each other until you try to run a frame, and then it will realize, holy crap, we're all within each other, let's push each other apart so that we're not intersecting. And you can see what's happening here. It's like going all crazy, right? So they're exploding because they were they had too much interaction. Okay, so that's pretty much, I mean, there are a lot of other parameters that we can play with, but I'm just really going to go over some of the basics. You can play around this with this yourself. This is non-uniform. Obviously, you know, what you were able to do is say you don't want as many wide as you want. You want less spacing wide as you want high, and so on and so forth. It's also very useful. But alternating rows, you know, stuff like that. So just play around with this and you'll see what's going on. Then we have a birth group. Now birth group is probably, I mean, they're all useful depending on what you're doing, but birth group is probably one of the most fun ones to have, because for instance you could have a car, and let me show you my elite modeling skills by modeling a car. I hope you are extremely impressed. Right, so there we go. That is a car. So now we could have, now the good thing about birth group is if we have a car with 1,000 parts or whatever the case, we can say, you know, we want to add all these things into our birth group, hide the original object. Now it just looks like boxes because we still have a shape in here. But if we get rid of this shape, because we were specifying what shape we want it to be, but we just use the birth group shape, you'll notice that now we have particles that actually look like the meshes that we've added in here. So now the collisions are going to be all off. If we run this, you can see they actually did a good job. But what you might have noticed just by watching it fall is that the collisions are actually set to box, so it's not very accurate. If we visualize the collision shapes, you see that everything is a box, and if we want this to be, you know, cylinders or whatever, then we have to set this to accordingly. In this case, we're going to use like concave hull, just because we have two different types of shapes, right? Concave hull is of course a lot slower calculation than one of the more generic ones, but this will allow us to have much more accurate collisions going on. See that? Yeah, sweet. So this of course doesn't only, oops, I'm not sure what I deleted. This of course doesn't only apply to if you want to unhide the object that the particles hit, you just click unhide here and then you can grab them and delete them. Now they're still within the particle system, but if you update, you'll notice that they are gone because they're no longer there, right? Alright, so this birth group also allows you to add not just individual objects, but we can grab, for instance, a geosphere, convert it to an editable poly, grab all the edges and split them so that each triangle is its own element, right? So what we can do then is within the birth group we can add the geosphere, and now if we now I turned this back to boxes for a second because I would like to demonstrate something. But if we now update this particle, you see that we have one particle. But if we click on object element and now we update, we can see that we have 320 particles. And each of them, if we hide the original shape, now we're looking at the particles, but each of them are separate, you see? So they're going all a little crazy and they're not colliding properly, and this is because we have, we don't want to use concave Hall as a collision object when you have one-sided polygons or like planes of that sort. So what you want to do in such a situation so that it can calculate its collision shape properly is you want to add, if you run into this issue, add a shell modifier to your original object. So let's unhide the object, unhide, and not make the particles visible. So now we have a nice little shell modifier on it. We could have inverted if we don't want it to be so visible, but I'm more worried about the collision, so I'm going to leave it like that. And then if we turn this back on, now we can update the particles, and what we can do now is set the collision as concave Hall, and what we're going to find when we turn on the wireframe is that now it has really nice collisions. So we can hide the original object, and you see that it now collides as those triangles, right? So that's pretty sweet, right? The next birth script, of course, is from the old one, birth paint, so on and so forth. Now we have a birth stream, and a birth stream is basically kind of like it's just like kind of like a shooting pistol. It's kind of like your original birth, but it has a speed applied to it in the but as a kind of as a force, right? So you can have these guys coming out non-stop. So if you're going to do like a fountain or a blood splatter or something like that, maybe this is the route you want to take, right? And I mean, all this stuff is self-explanatory. Now these things here are actually like stuff like a data icon, data operator, and data preset. This is actually not, I mean, they merged it all into one, but these were two separate plugins. One was part of PFlow Toolbox 2, and one was PFlow Toolbox 3. And Toolbox 3 is a little bit more programming orientated than physics driven, right? Toolbox 2 was a little bit more physics driven. So, but let's demonstrate something about Toolbox 3, which is very useful. I'm gonna get rid of all of this stuff, and let's make, for instance, let's make a sphere. Let's pull in the head. Now, this is just to demonstrate how this becomes useful, for instance. Now, this head is courtesy of bitmap. So let's drag in standard flow. We're going to get rid of the position because that's going to be controlled by what we're dragging in. We don't want a speed, we don't want a rotation. I'm going to get rid of that. Oops. Just the speed and the rotation. And then we're going to tell the birth to birth everything at 0, not at 9 months, and then amount 1. And then And then we're going to drag in a data preset. Now, data preset is pretty much a data operator, but with all the settings already set. A data operator, it's kind of like a math operation with like a node-based programming method. It's a little complicated. I'll show you a little bit. If you click on the math operator, you can open the data flow, and here you can, for instance, you can drag in, standard input, position vector. So now all the particles that will go through here will then tell its position vector through this node, which you can then connect to some other node, like rotation. So you can give some position into rotation and so on and so forth. So it's math, but visual math. But basically, if you drag in something like a data preset, some of that math is already done. Some of that stuff is already done for you. Of course, you lose a lot of the control, but you don't have to exactly know what you're doing. For instance, this one is very useful, particle per vertex, because what that allows you to do is create one particle for every vertex on your mesh, which is very useful in many ways. But the cool thing about that is, now you might say, oh, I could have already done that with my position object. You remember this position object from PFlow, which is pretty much Toolbox 1. You could kind of do it if you already know the vertex count of your object. You can kind of do it, but it's messy. You can say, vertex all, and then pop your particles on that vertex. But it's not as straightforward and not as dynamic as this is, right? Because it creates all the particles on each individual vertex, and the particle number doesn't have to be set. So that's this data preset. It's good fun. Now we have a random walk. Random walk is kind of a fun little thing. Basically, what it does is it randomizes the animation of a particle flow, but it's cool, I guess. Right, let's have a little fun. Let's give this guy a nice little wiggly face, shall we? So, how we're going to do is, first I feel more comfortable in eligible poly, and then I'm probably going to grab this loop, loop it around, grab these two vertices and split. Now I'm going to grab this element and detach, and we're going to call this face. Alright, so now now we have this face separated, right? Maybe we'll really separate it, right? So now let's go over some of the fun little things we could do with such a separated face. Now, as I said before, one of my favorite things here is glue, right? And a good way to use glue on a face would be, first we're going to make a copy of this face. Copy face, and we're going to call this particle rig face. And we're going to isolate that. So that face is no longer there. Let's just make sure. Magic. It's no longer there. Now we're going to also grab all these edges. Oops. All these edges. All these edges. And then we're going to split it. And then, as we learned before, we're going to add a shell modifier to the whole thing. Now we're going to add a particle flow, or mFlow, right? Got this nice little particle system going, but instead of using a birth grid, we're going to use a birth group. We're going to say we want to use this face, and we want to use every element of this face. Ta-da! Now we don't want a shape, even though that was pretty cool too. And we want the collision to be concave hull. Okay, now just to make sure, let's visualize the collisions. Cool. And now we want to get rid of the spin. And now let's just take a look at what this does. Already pretty much fun. It's falling down, breaking into pieces. Now if we want to hide the original shape, just click on hide. So now that was pretty cool, but we want this to fall down in one piece. The reason why it's not falling down in one piece right now is because some of these things are intersecting with each other, and so they're pushing each other apart. To solve this issue, we're just going to go into the collision shape, and we're going to say, well, maybe we don't want them to be we want them to have maybe a higher tolerance. So let's go maybe 2. So this way the collision shapes intersect with each other at 0.2 inches, or allows intersection without actually registering the collision. So now when it falls, it's already doing it a lot less, but we can see around the tight areas like the eyes and the mouth and the nose, it's still colliding pretty much. So we want to tone that down even more. So we're going to go a little crazy and say 0.5. So for each half an inch, it allows intersection. So that's pretty good. It's coming down pretty nicely as one piece. And then when it gets to the bottom, of course it shatters into, shatters into a million pieces. And it doesn't shatter, it just, doesn't stay together. So now we want this to stay together. So we're going to turn off visualization on the collision object, but we're going to add a glue in here. And the glue is basically just creating bindings between different particles. So if we have two particles next to each other, they're always going to try to stay next to each other. And that's pretty much what glue is. Now there is a visualized binding here that allows us to see within the viewport how the bindings happen. But when you turn this on, this parameter never changes unless you go back to frame 0. So even if you're on frame 0, you have to go to another frame and then back to 0 to visualize this. It's been like that for a while. Alright, so yeah, so now these bindings are already created. Now if we turn on wireframe, we can see that there are many gaps. For instance, while this is bind with this, or this is bind with that particle for some reason, it's not, there's no connection here. So this will come apart here, this will come apart, the whole cheeks will come apart and stuff like that. And if you need bindings between all your particles, you might want to turn up this distance. And this distance, we're gonna go a little crazy maybe. We're gonna say like 20. Yeah. So now there are still some cases where you see some binding holes here. There's bindings here, but there's no connection between these two or these two. And now this is no longer due to the distance, this is due to our limit of bindings. You can see that this particle here is bound to this particle, this particle, this particle, and that particle. And those are 4 particles. If we look over here, we can see that the max bindings per particle is set to 4. So we're not allowing this to bind to any other particle because it's already bound to 4. But we also want this to bound to this particle, and maybe even to that. Like we want some real connections going on, so that we don't see stuff like this here. You see, so the face would just rip apart here because there are no bindings going across. So what we're going to do is say we want this to be 8 particles. And now you can see, because we set the max up higher, that the bindings are pretty well now. Now, we can, now just just so we can see where we're at, let's just run this a little bit. We'll drag this down. Bum, 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 bum. And you can see it's all staying together, and now when we hit the floor, it's kind of gonna collapse on itself. Blop. See? It's almost like hitting the floor at 100 miles an hour. But we're kind of recovering as we go further, and you can see that despite the fact that they all kind of collapsed into each other, into themselves, they are maintaining the shape of the face. You see? And that's what we want, right? We don't want it to break up into individual little pieces. We want it to maintain the shape of the face. Now you can increase that a little bit, because right now we have a maximum distance limit of how much it should stretch, and we're going to say 105%, and we're also going to say we don't want it to collapse on itself as much, no more than 100%. So basically it's only going to stretch out about 0.5%. 0.5% of each individual distance. So 0.5% for these two particles would be different than 0.5% for these two particles, but you get the point. So next, yeah, so that's pretty neat. I mean, we can take a look at that again now with the new change. Yeah, and you see that it tries to maintain its shape a little bit more. It's not very rigid, but it's pretty cool. Face a little animated. Alright, sweet. Now let's go up to the next step and say that we want this actually to stay on the head. That would be neat, huh? So let's hide these for a second and make sure that this stuff is hidden. So the head right now is just a mesh, right? Just a geometry. But we want to have our particles kind of stay where the face is, right? Just kind of react to physics. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a collision shape to the mesh. Now, when you used to add collisions within particles, you would just add a U deflector, right? And then you would add the object to the U deflector, and then you would bring in a collision here, and then you would add the U deflector, right? Well, in mParticles it works a little different. For the mParticles to recognize the collision, you have to have an mParticle collision, not the normal collision, right? It won't see the collision objects if you have the normal collision. You have to have an mParticle collision. And in effort for your mParticle collision to be recognized, you have to have PFlow collision shape onto the mesh itself. Now, this actually is not on until you click this activate button. Then it has now it's an active collision object. So now with the mParticle collision within your list, I can click on add and click on male head, and now I've added the male head to the collision shapes. Now if I turn the particle system back on, what you'll notice is that when we run this animation, it will now collide. It's outside of the chin, so it's just falling down. But if we for instance had this shape over here instead, it would now collide with the shape. You get the point. We don't want to waste too much time, right? So now here's the fun part. This glue stuff, right? It's not limited to particles within particle links, but you can actually add links between particles and collision objects. So we can add another glue, ta-da, and we can tell this glue to be red to differentiate it from the original blue glue nodes that we have, and we visualize it. And remember, we have to go to a frame and then go back to another frame to to actually see the visualization, right? Which just totally disappeared, but that's cool, we just do it again. But what you'll notice is that we still have, the red is not working. Yeah, let's do yellow, I guess. Let's do green. Alright, I'm getting carried away. But what you'll notice is that we still have, our connections are not between the collision object and the particles, but between the particles themselves. Now, we also don't want this to be set to simplified. We want this to be set to distance. This will change how the particles are connected from the pivot points to the edges, and it will change the way it's calculated. I'm not really sure how that works. That's a little beyond me, but I know the result difference that you get from it. So what we don't want is the particles. Here's what we're binding with, right? So currently we're binding with our current particle events, with all the particles within this event. No. But we want this to bind with a deflector. Which deflector? The male head deflector, right? So now we see our connections happening around the edge of the face, right? That's pretty good. But maybe we'll turn this up a little bit. 8. Maybe we'll even increase. Oh, we want this distance not to stretch that much. Almost not at all. And we also don't want it to collapse in itself. So now if we're going to run this, let's see what happens. Ah, look at that. So now the face is like wiggling, but it's staying in the face position, right? So that's pretty cool. But we are not stopping there, are we? No, we're not. So we're gonna add a little ball here, a sphere, and move this out a little bit. I'm going to turn off the particle system just so I can operate a little smoother. Yeah, that's a really big fist. Okay, so like so, and then maybe at 30 it starts to do its thing after the face is settled a little bit. Let's say 20 frames it goes across, so a little less than a second. Pow, right? So now it's pow, 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 pow. And now we're going to add a collision shape to it. We want this to have a smooth surface because we don't want them to rip on the face too much. We kind of just want to push it, you know. They get hung up a little bit if you don't. They get hung up on the corners if you don't have this set to smooth surface. So now all we have to do is within the collision stuff, we'll just add it at the top. We'll add a new one. mParticle collisions, add from list sphere, right? Now we'll turn this particle system back on, and we're going to turn off visualizing of the glue, just so we don't have those blue lines happening. Back to 0 so that they turn off. And then when we run this simulation, we see his face is all wibbly, and just as his face settles a little bit, obviously it's kind of difficult to drag through this timeline because there's a lot of calculation happening. We can see that the ball hits the face and it all wobbles. Alright, so here's a short play blast, very low quality of what's happening. So we can see the face wiggling nicely just as it settles down. He gets punched in the face and wobbles all over the place. So, but we don't have to stop there necessarily. We can say we don't actually want to render the particles. We want to render instead we want to render the original face. So what we can do is we can say unhide by name. We want to unhide the face, and then we can add a particle skinner. Now what this allows us to do is add our current particle system, and then we activate skinning. Ta-da! Activate it, right? And now we can unselect this, and we can see that of course the grid lines and stuff like that are no longer there from the particles, and we can see that the face is now animated based on the movements of the particles. So we're using the particles as a rig to skin the face. Now the powerful element of that is, of course, that we can still add stuff like turbo smooth on top of that. Add a turbo smooth on top of here, I think. No. Alright, well then you just need two different shapes. You need a collision shape, right? And then that doesn't render. We can just like maybe display as box or whatever. Box non-renderable, and then you need a copy of that doesn't have this thingy on there, and then you can add a nice little turbo smooth. So so now we have this face. There's going to be a gap there, but you know, you could solve it if you have the time or whatever. But what you can see now is we got this nice smooth little jiggly face. And then somebody gets really angry. Wow. Wobble wobble. Yep, sweet. Alright, well, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and yeah, have fun. Bye.